When Daniel Ricciardo returned to Red Bull for the first time after his 4-year absence, he was not the same Formula 1 driver, and not in a good way. It was an unofficial but quietly understood truth in the F1 paddock early this year that Ricciardo had been back on the Red Bull simulator and struggled. 2 years at McLaren apparently had quite a negative impact, but how bad was it? What's the prognosis a few months later, and what does it mean for Ricciardo's chances of getting back on the grid? Ricciardo spending a year on the sidelines in a third driver role with Red Bull after negotiating an early exit from his McLaren contract, having struggled for 2 years alongside Lando Norris. His Red Bull position has a lot of marketing work attached to it, like meet and greets and show car runs, including one on the Nordschleife later this year. But Ricciardo's also driving on the simulator and has some tyre tests planned, so there's some serious F1 driver work to do as well. This didn't start very well, with rumours emerging over the winter that Ricciardo's return to the Red Bull simulator was poor. One person with knowledge of Ricciardo's situation has since said to us that it was a disaster. There were whispers of Ricciardo being nowhere near Max Verstappen or Sergio Perez, and of Red Bull being pretty shocked by the data, most likely the brake trace, for it was this key area of driving that Ricciardo ended up thinking about so consciously at McLaren. But this was not formally recognised until the Australian Grand Prix weekend, where Ricciardo was back in an F1 paddock for the first time, operating as Red Bull's reserve option at his home race. Asked by us about how much rebuilding Red Bull had to do with Ricciardo after his McLaren stint, Red Bull team principal Christian Horner chose his words carefully, but confirmed Ricciardo had returned in a limited form at first, having picked up what Horner called bad habits elsewhere. Horner said that Red Bull didn't recognise Ricciardo's driving as that of the person who had left the team a few years earlier. Ricciardo had excelled in his first 2 seasons outside of Red Bull, at least once he had got to grips with the Renault, and his new team also improved the car. But the 2 years with McLaren marked a surprisingly rapid decline as Ricciardo grappled with not one but 2 cars built to very different rules that he just couldn't gel with. Ricciardo liked to take a lot of entry speed into the corner, braking later and harder, then used his feel for the car to maximise the grip mid-corner and help mitigate the usual time loss associated with that kind of technique. The McLarens needed a lot of overlap in the braking and cornering phases, especially into slow corners, which led to pretty severe measures as Ricciardo's driving was reconstructed in an extremely unusual way to try to match the peculiar needs of the cars. Ricciardo was having to think consciously about where to brake, how hard to brake, how much to reduce the brake pressure, and how much to overlap the brake with input on the steering wheel. All of this has to happen without conscious thought, and at McLaren it never did for Ricciardo. In hindsight, this paint-by-numbers way of driving didn't seem to have any real benefit. It certainly did nothing to address Ricciardo's trajectory, and his second season alongside Norris was significantly worse than the first. A couple of theories emerged, one that McLaren could not or would not develop the car in a way that would have theoretically migrated more towards Ricciardo's preference, and two, that the attempt to reconfigure his driving was counterproductive and he would have been better off just driving the car wrong, but at least in his natural way. Instead, the result was that Ricciardo's driving technique had been mangled and his confidence bruised, which is what Red Bull encountered when he drove their simulator again for the first time. The good news is this is already being unpicked. By the time Ricciardo drove on the Red Bull simulator again, more time had passed, which meant having arrived the first time with a McLaren way of driving in his mind, he'd automatically started to migrate back towards his way of driving anyway. That's no surprise really, given what we said about the McLaren style never becoming second nature. Horner described it as having had time off over Christmas and a chance to reset. When Ricciardo came back and got into the 2023 work, he hit the ground running, and that the upshot is he already looks far more like the driver Red Bull knew from before. This is also consistent with suggestions Ricciardo himself feels re-energised and happy with his 2023 arrangement. He was back on site at a Grand Prix in Australia where he conducted an extensive amount of promotional activity but was then embedded within the race team for the weekend. Ricciardo had a seat fit, he was in the debriefs, he followed the sessions on the pit wall. He was not in Melbourne just as a show pony. And as much as Ricciardo's Red Bull return was played down from a he could get a race seat here again one day perspective, he's not there just to kick back and rake in some easy cash. He's there to do a job and get something tangible out of it for himself, mentally and professionally, and finding a path to re-establish himself as the driver everybody knew him as pre-McLaren is a top order priority. Red Bull says that Ricciardo's feedback of the car from the simulator correlates well with what it's doing in reality. It hints at a connection that Ricciardo was genuinely lacking at McLaren, but now he's desperate to get in the car at some point to validate that, and the tyre testing he has planned means he should get more than one chance behind the wheel of a Red Bull in a relevant environment, not just doing demonstrations and donuts. The positive noises from Red Bull and the Ricciardo camp suggest that this early work with the team has ticked a very important box in Ricciardo's quest to eventually return to the grid. He was convinced with the right machinery he could show his true level again, not what he was reduced to during his McLaren struggle, and if he started to drive the Red Bull effectively on the simulator, that's at least something. Of course, he and Red Bull will want to check that in reality, but the signs are promising. If Ricciardo continues to piece himself back together in this role, then his appetite to find a race seat will grow. That's the first hurdle that Ricciardo needs to decide he definitely wants to race in F1 again. The second is finding an available seat, and the third is finding a seat that he's interested in. Ricciardo wants to be in a top car. He said as much already and indicated he doesn't want to be back in F1 just to make up the numbers or look like an idiot again in the midfield. The question is, will a top car be available? It doesn't look hugely likely. Ricciardo's stock dived in his time at McLaren, and no amount of being hyped up by Red Bull will fix that, plus there aren't any seats going. If Perez continues to be a strong support act for Verstappen, Ricciardo will struggle to open a door at Red Bull again. He really needs an implosion between Verstappen and Perez to drive Checo out, and for Ricciardo to make a really good account of himself behind the scenes to have any chance. And Ferrari and Mercedes are unlikely to have any availability for 2024, let alone interest in Ricciardo. So what are the other options? Aston Martin set on Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll, and Alpine snubbed Ricciardo's return last year to lock itself into Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly instead. A return to McLaren can be ruled out, which just leaves Haas, Sauber, AlphaTauri and Williams. Of those, presumably Red Bull slotting Ricciardo back into its sister team would be a low fuss move, especially if Nick de Vries continues to struggle, but we can't see Ricciardo wanting to return to that kind of junior environment, especially given the team's poor form in 2022 and 2023. Haas and Williams didn't interest Ricciardo last summer and aren't options with particularly high ceilings in the short or even medium term. But Sauber might be a genuine option. It will be Audi's works team in 2026, by which time Ricciardo will be 36, but Audi will be investing in the team in the meantime, which boosts its chances of being a more competitive midfield proposition, and if Ricciardo is back to his best or anywhere close to that, then he could realistically command a seat there for the start of the Audi era proper. And the team is run by Andreas Seidel, the man who took Ricciardo to McLaren in the first place, and while Seidel was also ultimately key to Ricciardo's exit, they seem to maintain a genuinely good relationship through that process. What it shows is that Ricciardo might be in a better position psychologically and as a driver than last summer when he was looking for a seat, but his options aren't really that different. Ricciardo may therefore need to lower his expectations to land a drive, but the purpose of his year out of racing and his return to Red Bull was to recharge, rebuild and reassess. That process seems to be on a good trajectory after what sounds like quite an iffy start.